Mark, thanks a lot for the very nice introduction. IISS, thank you very much for the invitation, the opportunity to appear before you. I was grateful to hear Mark's examples of the brighter side of the proliferation picture. We don't hear that all that frequently. The overall picture is not quite so optimistic, and one of the reasons it's not quite so optimistic is because of the nuclear activities of North Korea and Iran. And so I'd like to focus heavily on the issues of North Korea and Iran, and then conclude with some observations about the possible implications for North Korea and Iran and proliferation challenges in general of the outcome, whatever it may be, of the U.S.-Russia deal on Syrian chemical weapons. In both the cases of North Korea and Iran, we're witnessing at the moment heightened diplomatic activity aimed at the resumption of both the six-party talks in the case of North Korea and the P5+1 talks in the case of Iran. Of the two, prospects for North Korea are particularly bleak, in my view. Under Kim Jong-un, North Korea has engaged in lethal provocations, conducted nuclear and long-range rocket tests, and closed down economic and other interactions with South Korea. North Korea is believed to be producing weapons-grade uranium at a covert enrichment facility, miniaturizing its nuclear warheads, and working on a three-stage missile capable of reaching the United States. And recently, it has restarted its 5-megawatt reactor that was designed for the production of plutonium. And it's insisted that it's no longer bound by its previous denuclearization commitments, and it's proclaimed that its nuclear weapons capability is permanent. China is clearly highly disturbed and frustrated by North Korea's behavior, and China is willing from time to time to apply pressure and to give its difficult neighbor some tough advice. But it's unwilling to bring all of its leverage to bear on Pyongyang. Presumably, it fears the potential consequences of applying pressure for the survivability of the regime and for the stability of Northeast Asia. And China's record has been uneven in enforcing sanctions against North Korea, especially in curbing the illicit activities of North Korean banks, brokers, and front companies that operate within China. North Korea, apparently motivated by a need for foreign assistance and also a fear of further alienating China, is currently on a charm offensive. It's re-engaging with South Korea, reopening the Kaesong Industrial Complex, resuming North-South family reunions, reaching out diplomatically, and calling for a resumption of the six-party talks. But while calling for resumption, it hopes to change the basic purpose of the talks, from denuclearization of North Korea to exploring arms control arrangements among existing nuclear powers, including North Korea. It's become increasingly clear since Kim Jong-un replaced his father that North Korea has no intention of giving up all of its nuclear weapons. For tactical reasons and to gain compensation, it may be prepared to accept limits on its nuclear and missile capabilities, presumably temporary and reversible limits, but nuclear weapons have become so integral to the regime's self-identification, to its ability to maintain control internally, and to its declared strategy for deterring the United States that complete and voluntary denuclearization is hard to imagine. The only way North Korea will ultimately be rid of nuclear weapons is through regime change or far-reaching regime transformation. But having a realistic appreciation of North Korean intentions doesn't mean we should accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. There's a very big difference between a de facto and hopefully non-permanent capability that all major powers are pledged to eliminate, and a permanent capability that the international community has decided to live with. The latter is strategically and politically unacceptable to the United States, to South Korea, and many other countries. And it would be a major blow to the global nonproliferation regime, setting a terrible precedent for other countries, especially Iran. So complete denuclearization should remain the goal. But even though prospects for achieving the goal through negotiations is small, it doesn't mean we should abandon negotiations altogether. An interim agreement that halted further progress in North Korea's nuclear and missile programs would be of considerable strategic value, even if it deferred further steps toward complete denuclearization to an uncertain future. Such interim constraints could at least keep a lid on the North Korean threat and therefore make it easier to defend against, until conditions exist for fundamental change in the North that could finally make the goal of complete denuclearization a realistic possibility. China is now energetically pressing for an early resumption of the six-party talks. But while it agrees that the goal must be denuclearization, it wants to resume the talks right away without preconditions. It apparently believes that early resumption would help discourage further North Korean provocations and maintain a relatively calm regional environment. But the United States, South Korea, and Japan all insist that before talks can resume, Pyongyang must make tangible steps to demonstrate a commitment to moving toward denuclearization. Steps such as committing to refrain from further nuclear and long-range rocket tests, and suspension of all nuclear activities at the Yongbyon nuclear complex. More fundamentally, the U.S. and its partners believe it must be clearly agreed that the purpose of the talks is denuclearization of the DPRK, not nuclear arms control among nuclear weapon states that include North Korea. In my view, reconvening the talks without any clarity regarding the fundamental purpose would be a recipe for recriminations and prolonged stalemate. But getting North Korea to return to the goal of denuclearization, if achievable at all, will take quite some time and will require China to lean on North Korea much more heavily than it's prepared to do so far. And so at this point, the outlook on North Korea doesn't look very good. The outlook is somewhat better in the case of Iran. Before the June presidential election in Iran, Iran wasn't serious about reaching agreement, except on its own terms. They felt they could weather the sanctions, either by finding workarounds or wearing down the international community's support for them, they didn't think they needed to make compromises on their nuclear program in order to get the sanctions lifted. President Rouhani and his team are much more realistic. They understand the severity of their economic situation. They recognize the economy can't be fixed unless the sanctions are removed, and they know that removing sanctions will require reaching an accommodation on the nuclear issue. So unlike before the elections, there are now prospects for a real negotiation. But that doesn't mean agreement is going to be easy. Iran's goals in the negotiation, I think, will boil down to three critical points. One, get sanctions lifted as soon as possible. Two, gain agreement to an enrichment program in Iran. And three, pay the smallest possible price in terms of constraints on Iran's nuclear program and Iran's future nuclear options. With the upcoming negotiations in mind, Iran has conducted an active public diplomacy campaign. They've emphasized their moderation, their willingness to accept transparency, and their desire to reach early agreement. They've sent Rosh Hashanah greetings, acknowledged the Holocaust, released political prisoners, published op-eds in the Washington Post, and condemned the use of chemical weapons, although without blaming the Syrian regime. We can expect this public diplomacy campaign to go into high gear next week when President Rouhani comes to New York for the UN General Assembly. The purpose of this public campaign is to persuade world opinion that the new Iranian leadership is reasonable and flexible, that it should be given the benefit of the doubt, and that imposing additional sanctions at this stage would undermine prospects for the upcoming negotiations. A key question, of course, is where the supreme leader stands on all of this. Clearly, Rouhani and his people wouldn't be saying what they have been saying without the approval of Khamenei. The leader presumably recognizes that adjustments in Syria's posture are needed, but whether he believes he can get away with tactical or cosmetic adjustments is still not clear. And it's also not clear how much slack he will cut Rouhani to find a negotiated way out of Iran's predicament. A critical test will come on the issue of uranium enrichment. Both Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif have repeatedly said that Iran will not give up enrichment. At this point, to me at least, it's inconceivable that any Iranian government would agree to and try to sell at home a total ban on enrichment. Rouhani and his team may hope that accepting transparency measures, such as the IAEA Additional Protocol, will be sufficient to overcome the reluctance of the United States and others to permit a domestic enrichment program in Iran. I don't believe the Obama administration has yet taken a decision on whether to accept an enrichment program as part of a deal. But I'm confident that transparency would not be enough to alleviate concerns about enrichment. Transparency doesn't address the key U.S. goal of precluding Iran's nuclear breakout capability, which is the ability suddenly to abandon constraints, disable cameras, kick out IAEA inspectors, and use existing centrifuges and stockpiled enriched uranium to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for one or more nuclear weapons before the international community has time to react. Constraining breakout capability would require limits on Iran's enrichment capacity in terms of the numbers and types of centrifuges. It would require limits on Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium in terms of quantities, enrichment levels, chemical forms, and locations. It would also require enhanced IAEA monitoring, including remote, real-time surveillance of key locations. In other words, it's not good enough for the IAEA every couple of weeks to come to the facility and download film from cameras and look at what's happened in the last interval. There needs to be a monitor in Vienna that's getting real-time information from critical sites. So the additional protocol would not be enough. The compromises, in my view, that would be necessary on enrichment will be hard to swallow, both in Tehran and in Washington. I've singled out enrichment here because I think it's central to the negotiations. But there are several other issues that will also be difficult to resolve, including the disposition of the Arak heavy water reactor, the components of an initial confidence-building package, the pace and content of sanctions relief, and a resolution of the IAEA's concerns about past Iranian nuclear activities that have a military dimension. So despite positive signals from both Tehran and Washington in recent times that a serious negotiation will get underway soon, the obstacles to a deal will be formidable. Having said that, I think it's interesting to speculate on whether and how the outcome of the U.S.-Russia deal on Syrian chemical weapons will affect the Iran and North Korean nuclear issues, as well as other proliferation challenges. Of course, there are justifiable doubts whether this largely impromptu CW deal could succeed under the best of circumstances. And to say the very least, the current circumstances are hardly ideal. But assuming the deal is implemented effectively and in a reasonable time, it could have favorable implications for other proliferation challenges. Take the Russian role, for example. For its own reasons, and one can speculate on Russia's own reasons, Russia has become heavily invested in the Syria CW deal. Getting Syria to implement the deal responsibly will require persistent Russian engagement and heavy pressure. If successful, Russia will get much of the credit. Its international stature will be enhanced and its commitment to nonproliferation reinforced. As a result, it may be inclined to play a more assertive role in other proliferation-related cases, including Iran. The example of Russia stepping up, and especially of Russia working jointly with the United States, could become an important model of major power cooperation to address today's most vexing proliferation challenges. Perhaps it could provide a stimulus for China to accept greater responsibility and act more assertively on North Korea, and to join with the United States in addressing that problem. Such major power activism and collaboration could help remedy one of the principal reasons the global nonproliferation regime is now under such heavy pressure: the tendency of certain major powers to give nonproliferation goals a lower priority relative to other national interests, and their failure to find common ground with other major powers in confronting proliferation threats. The success of the Syria CW deal would also give a boost to international organizations charged with implementing and verifying proliferation agreements. the ability of an empowered OPCW to account for and destroy Syrian CW would do much to counter the reluctance in the United States and elsewhere to rely on such organizations to get uncooperative countries to comply with their obligations. It could have a positive impact on the IAEA's role in Iran. Success on the Syrian CW issue might also help reinvigorate the UN Security Council's role in enforcing compliance with non-proliferation agreements. The Council played such a role in Iraq in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, but it has largely been gridlocked and paralyzed in recent years because of disputes among key permanent members. Perhaps Syria CW can help restore the practice of P5 cooperation that has been sorely lacking in recent years. Perhaps the biggest winner from success of the Syrian CW deal would be diplomacy itself. The very disappointing track record of non-proliferation diplomacy with North Korea and Iran has led to deep skepticism about the value of negotiations with determined and resourceful countries with nuclear ambitions. And it has produced a growing preference for abandoning diplomacy in favor of regime change, whether through military or other coercive means. Any compromise with Iran or North Korea would be a hard sell in America for the Obama administration. Successful implementation of the CW deal would create more political space for the administration to negotiate and win support for future agreements, especially an agreement on Iran. Many critics argue that even the successful implementation of the CW deal will convey the message that the international community is less interested in the outcome of the Syrian civil war than CW. And this could have the effect of strengthening the Assad regime. I think there's some merit to this concern, but from the perspective of many Iranians who seem genuinely to believe that the nuclear issue is only a pretext for the real US goal of regime change, the focus on CW and reluctance to get involved in the Syrian civil war could help convince them that the Obama administration is prepared to address the nuclear issue separately and to leave regime change to the people of Iran. And this could make Iran more amenable to a compromise on the nuclear issue. Another criticism of Syrian CW, of the deal, is that it takes the military option off the table, at least for the time being, and that this will reduce incentives for others, especially Iran, to negotiate seriously on the nuclear issue. Notwithstanding the Obama administration's insistence that the military option remains on the table, any perception that the United States is reluctant to use force, whether in Syria or Iran, could give some elements in Iran the impression that they could act more assertively in their neighborhood with impunity. But even ruling out force altogether, which Obama is not prepared to do, would not significantly affect prospects for a nuclear deal with Iran, in my view. Iran's incentive for reaching an accommodation on the nuclear issue is not to avoid military attack. Its incentive is to get rid of the sanctions that are crippling the economy and to restore Iran's international standing. The continuing credible threat of military attack is a critical factor in getting Bashar to follow through with his CW commitment. But in my view, it is not a critical factor in getting Iran to negotiate seriously on the nuclear issue. Now, I've been arguing for the last couple of moments that the success of the Syrian CW deal would give a boost to various nonproliferation efforts. But I think the opposite is also true. Its failure would be a setback. Having gone way out on a limb and put its prestige on the line, the unraveling of the deal could make Russia much more reluctant to play an assertive role in the future, especially when such a role could involve once again putting pressure on a close ally. If the U.S.-Russian collaboration comes to naught, especially if Russia is seen as more interested in protecting its client than in ridding him of chemical weapons, there will be a great reluctance to teaming up again. And the model for major power cooperation on proliferation cases will be less attractive. Failure would also perpetuate doubts about whether organizations like the OPCW and the IAEA can provide effective verification in uncooperative states. It would also perpetuate the Security Council's inability to play its role as enforcer of nonproliferation obligations. And support for diplomacy would be weakened. Diplomatic efforts would continue, surely in the case of Iran, less surely with respect to North Korea. But if Assad proves deceitful and obstinate, and the Russians are seen as unable or unwilling to deliver the Syrians, the political space for President Obama to negotiate a compromise with Iran or North Korea would be narrowed. Now, I don't want to overstate this case. Each of the proliferation challenges are unique and are driven by their own particular dynamics. Success on Syrian CW won't ensure success in other nonproliferation negotiations, nor will its failure doom those negotiations. But in my view, the outcome of the Syrian CW deal could have a significant effect. Thank you.